In January 2014, the body of 18-year-old Sophie Grant was discovered in the living room of a quiet farmhouse in Cedar Creek, South Carolina. The investigation that followed unveiled a harrowing tale of obsession, secrecy, and betrayal. At the center of it all was Luke Henderson, the admired track and field coach at Maple Ridge High School. What began in the fall of 2013 as a seemingly innocent connection spiraled into a web of jealousy and deceit, culminating in a night of unthinkable violence that would leave the small community in shock. Luke Henderson had always been the kind of man people gravitated toward. At just 28 years old, his charm and natural ability to connect with others made him an ideal fit as the new track and field coach at Maple Ridge High School. His athletes admired him not only for his expertise, but for the genuine care he showed in helping them grow both on and off the track. Luke wasn't just a coach, he was a mentor, a trusted figure they could look up to. Luke's personal life seemed as steady and promising as his career. He had recently married Emily, his college sweetheart, in a heartfelt ceremony on April 14, 2012. Emily was a preschool teacher, beloved for her kindness and her passion for nurturing young minds. Together, they had settled into a modest but welcoming farmhouse on the outskirts of Cedar Creek. The house, though humble, held endless possibilities: a nursery, a garden, and a future brimming with love and hope. For Luke, transitioning into married life while taking on his new role was a delicate balance. The long hours at school and the demands of coaching often tested his energy, but Emily's unwavering support never faltered. She encouraged him to pursue his passion, reassuring him that they would always make time for each other. Weekends were spent tending to their home, dreaming of what was to come. Emily even started jotting down baby names in a small notebook, a quiet way of planning for the family they both envisioned. Sophie Grant lived a very different life. At 17 years old, she was the star volleyball player at Maple Ridge High School. Her striking beauty and outgoing personality made her the center of attention. But beneath her radiant exterior was a young woman yearning for love and stability. Sophie had grown up in a fractured home where arguments overshadowed parenting. Her father left when she was 10, and her mother, battling alcoholism, struggled to maintain their small, chaotic household. Sophie learned early how to fend for herself in a world that offered her little support. This instability shaped Sophie into someone who knew how to use charm to her advantage. She understood how to attract attention and wasn't afraid to push limits if it meant escaping the turmoil of her home life. Though admired at school, Sophie carried a deep insecurity, longing for someone who could see past her polished facade and offer the validation she had never known. That someone became Luke Henderson. It started in September 2012 during Luke's early months as the track and field coach at Maple Ridge High. Sophie began staying late after volleyball practice, finding excuses to watch his practices. Initially, it was nothing more than an innocent crush. She admired Luke's confidence and the way he earned the respect of his athletes. In Sophie's eyes, Luke wasn't just a coach. He was the embodiment of the stability she craved. For Luke, the attention was unexpected but flattering. Balancing his coaching responsibilities and his new marriage had proven more challenging than he anticipated. The late nights reviewing training strategies often came at the expense of time with his wife, Emily, who was deeply invested in her work at the local preschool. When Sophie started offering compliments, praising his coaching methods or leadership skills, Luke felt a kind of appreciation he didn't realize he had been missing. By October 2012, their interactions grew more frequent. Sophie began finding reasons to speak with Luke after practice, sometimes seeking advice on school or sharing concerns about her performance on the team. Luke, trying to be supportive, always obliged. Their conversations, once light-hearted, began to delve deeper. Sophie opened up about her struggles at home, how she felt unseen, and her dreams of a better life. Luke, with his natural instinct to guide and mentor, couldn't help but feel protective of her. One evening in late October, after a long practice, Luke stayed late to finish some paperwork. Sophie appeared at his office door, saying she had left something behind. Thanking him for always being so kind, she shared how much she admired him, not just as a coach, but as someone she felt genuinely cared. For Luke, the moment was unsettling. He saw Sophie as a troubled student seeking guidance, but her words stirred something deeper. The boundary between coach and student began to blur, and Luke, though conflicted, didn't stop it. By November 2012, their meetings had become a regular occurrence. Brief exchanges at practice turned into private discussions in Luke's office after hours. Sophie, encouraged by his kindness, began testing limits. She dressed to attract his attention and lingered after practices. Luke, grappling with guilt, tried to rationalize their interactions as mentorship, but Sophie had other intentions. Frustrated by his hesitation, she found ways to keep him engaged, staying late, brushing against him during conversations, and sending messages outside of school. Sophie understood Luke's vulnerabilities and skillfully used them to draw him closer.
By December 2012, their relationship had crossed the line. Late one evening, after a track meet, Luke found himself alone in the stadium with Sophie. The tension that had been building between them finally erupted. In the stillness of the empty field, under the faint glow of the overhead lights, they shared their first intimate moment. Luke, overwhelmed by a mix of desire and guilt, knew he had made a terrible mistake. But the connection between them was undeniable, and Sophie had no intention of letting him go. Their affair became a carefully guarded secret. They met late at night in Luke's office or in the secluded corners of the stadium when no one was around. Sophie maintained her image at school, but her fixation on Luke grew stronger with each passing day. For Luke, the affair became a source of unbearable guilt. He loved his wife, but found himself unable to escape Sophie's grip. By January 2013, cracks in their secret began to show. Sophie grew more possessive, sending Luke late-night texts and demanding his attention. She asked probing questions about his marriage, searching for signs of dissatisfaction. Luke, desperate to salvage his conscience, began to pull away. But Sophie wouldn't let him go. For her, the affair wasn't a fling. It was her lifeline, her escape from the life she despised. Sophie's obsession reached its breaking point when she noticed Emily attending more of Luke's meets. The way he smiled at his wife and introduced her to his team filled Sophie with jealous rage. She couldn't stand the thought of Luke giving Emily the love and attention she believed should be hers. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change their lives forever. What began as a reckless indulgence had turned into a dangerous entanglement neither could control. By July 2013, life for Luke and Emily Henderson appeared perfect to the outside world. They were a young, hopeful couple with a promising future. Emily, the steady force in their relationship, radiated grace and positivity. Despite Luke's demanding schedule, she made it a priority to attend every meet she could, her growing belly a proud symbol of their future. But beneath their smiles, Luke carried a heavy burden. His affair with Sophie had spiraled out of control, turning into a source of constant fear and anxiety. Sophie's obsession became relentless. Her once playful messages turned into desperate demands for Luke's attention. She began showing up unannounced at the track, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and longing. Sophie's world revolved entirely around Luke. Her fixation consumed her, fueled by the emptiness in her own life. With no family to turn to and no real friends to confide in, her grades slipped and she began missing volleyball practices. Her coach noticed but accepted Sophie's vague excuses. Meanwhile, her jealousy of Emily reached its breaking point. On August 14, 2013, everything changed. During a meet at Maple Ridge High, Emily made an unexpected appearance. She wore a loose dress that barely concealed her growing baby bump. Luke spotted her in the stands, and his smile was unmistakable. To him, Emily was the beacon of light in his increasingly dark world. Sophie, standing at the sidelines in her volleyball uniform, saw their interaction and felt a surge of uncontrollable rage. She couldn't comprehend how Luke could still love Emily after everything they had shared. She hated the way his face lit up for her, the way his gaze lingered on Emily even as he coached. That night, when Emily approached Luke to congratulate him after the meet, Sophie stood in the shadows, watching with a clenched jaw and trembling hands. The announcement of Emily's pregnancy, casually shared with the team and their families, was the final blow. Sophie stormed out, slamming the door as she fought back tears. To her, the pregnancy was a betrayal, a permanent symbol of Luke's love for Emily and the life he was building without her. From that moment, Sophie's thoughts fixated on one goal: removing Emily from Luke's life. Luke, unaware of Sophie's escalating rage, decided it was time to end the affair for good. On August 20th, 2013, he called Sophie into his office after practice. What he intended to be a final conversation turned volatile. Sophie begged, threatened, and cried, shifting between declarations of love and warnings about what she could do if he left her. Luke stood firm, walking away from her sobs echoing in the empty stadium. By November 1st, 2013, Sophie's obsession had reached dangerous new heights. Luke stopped responding to her messages and avoided her at all costs. Sophie's carefully constructed world of manipulation was unraveling, and she was determined to regain control. That rainy afternoon, Sophie drove to the Henderson home. She knew Luke wouldn't be there. He was at the school preparing for an upcoming meet. Sophie had no real plan, only the determination to confront Emily face to face. As she pulled into the driveway, her mind raced with possibilities. She imagined scaring Emily into leaving or finding something that would give her leverage. Emily answered the door with her usual kindness. She recognized Sophie from school and invited her inside when Sophie claimed she needed to retrieve something left in Luke's car. Emily offered her a glass of water while Sophie glanced around the kitchen. It was then Sophie noticed Emily's cup of tea on the counter. An idea struck her, reckless and chilling. As Emily turned to grab the water, Sophie slipped a vial of poison from her bag into the tea. Her hands trembled as she poured it, her heart pounding. Sophie didn't linger. She thanked Emily and left quickly, convincing herself that the poison would only make Emily sick, enough to scare her away. But deep down, Sophie wanted more. She wanted Emily out of Luke's life forever.
Later that evening, Emily began to feel unwell. At first, it was just a dull ache in her stomach, but by midnight, the pain had become unbearable. Luke rushed her to the hospital, panic etched across his face. The doctors acted quickly, but the damage was done. Emily had suffered a miscarriage, and the baby they had dreamed of was gone. Luke was devastated, but his grief soon turned to suspicion. Something about the timing felt wrong. Sophie had been at the house earlier that day, uninvited and unexpected. The thought lingered in his mind, but he had no proof. When Luke confronted Sophie the next day, she denied everything, her expression cold and unyielding. She warned him that he hadn't seen what she was truly capable of. Luke didn't know how to protect his wife from the growing storm, but one thing was clear: Sophie wasn't going to let go without a fight. By January 2014, the lives of Luke, Emily and Sophie were in complete disarray, though the outside world remained unaware. Sophie's obsession had reached its breaking point. Her once charming and flirtatious demeanor had become erratic and unstable. At 18 years old, Sophie was consumed by her fixation on Luke, seeing him not as a person, but as a possession, a lifeline in the chaos of her broken world. She felt betrayed, not only by Luke's rejection, but by Emily's continued presence in his life, a presence that symbolized everything Sophie believed she could never have. Luke, meanwhile, lived in constant fear. He had distanced himself from Sophie after the poisoning incident, but knew deep down that she remained a threat. He hadn't told Emily the full extent of the affair, attempting to shield her from the worst of it, but the guilt weighed heavily on him. Luke became quieter, more withdrawn, immersing himself in his coaching to avoid facing the wreckage of his personal life. Emily, still recovering from the loss of their baby, noticed the growing distance, but attributed it to grief. By early January, she had started to rebuild emotionally, leaning on her parents and close friends for support. She spent her days preparing their home for a fresh start, hoping that spring might bring a sense of renewal. She was determined to repair her marriage, unaware of the full extent of Luke's betrayal or the danger lurking in the shadows. Sophie, however, could not move on. In the months following the poisoning, her days were consumed by rage and despair. She spent hours scrolling through Luke's social media, analyzing every post and photo for signs of happiness with Emily. Each image fueled her growing hatred. By January 10th, 2014, Sophie made a decision. If she couldn't have Luke, no one could. On the evening of January 15, 2014, Sophie put her plan into motion. She knew Luke would be away coaching an away meet, leaving the house empty, except for Emily. Armed with a handgun she had stolen from her stepfather months earlier, Sophie drove to the Henderson home. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the lawns. She parked a few houses away and walked the rest of the way, the cold air biting at her skin as she rehearsed what she would say to Emily. Breaking into the house was easier than Sophie had expected. The back door was unlocked, a mistake often made in small, trusting communities. Inside, the house was warm and silent, a stark contrast to Sophie's frantic mind. She wandered through the living room, her fingers brushing over picture frames on the mantel. Each smiling photo of Luke and Emily only deepened her resolve. She didn't have to wait long. At around 8:45 p.m., Emily returned home, her arms full of groceries. She was startled to see Sophie sitting in the living room, but remained polite. Sophie's calm exterior quickly dissolved into anger, accusing Emily of ruining her life. Emily, confused and frightened, tried to reason with her, keeping her voice steady as she backed toward the kitchen. Sophie followed, pulling the gun from her jacket. The sight of the weapon changed everything. Emily's fear was immediate, but she stayed composed. Thinking quickly, she reached for her phone on the counter, pretending to fumble with it as she dialed 911 and whispered her address before Sophie noticed. When Sophie heard the faint voice of the dispatcher, her panic turned to rage. She grabbed Emily by the arm, dragging her back into the living room and yelling at her to sit down. Emily complied, her heart racing as she searched for a way to escape. At 9:03 p.m., the sound of sirens filled the air. Sophie's desperation turned into fury. She accused Emily of calling the police, waving the gun erratically as she paced the room. When the first police car pulled into the driveway, Sophie's behavior spiraled further. She fired a shot, grazing Emily's shoulder. The pain was sharp, but Emily used the chaos to crawl behind a couch, shielding herself as best she could. The police, hearing the gunshot, moved quickly. They issued commands from outside, attempting to negotiate, but Sophie was beyond reason. She barricaded herself in the house, firing wildly at the officers. In the chaos, one officer was struck and killed, a 34-year-old father of two, whose life was also claimed by that tragic night. By 9:20 p.m., the standoff reached its devastating conclusion. The police stormed the house, their actions swift and decisive. Sophie fired at them in panic, her shots wild and erratic. The officers returned fire, striking Sophie multiple times. She collapsed in the living room, her obsession and rage extinguished in an instant. The events of January 15, 2014 left the Cedar Creek community in shock. The once quiet neighborhood became a crime scene, with the flashing lights of police cars illuminating the tragedy that had unfolded. News of the violent standoff spread quickly, and within hours, Luke's affair with Sophie was exposed. The revelation shattered Luke's reputation. Parents pulled their children from his team, demanding his resignation. Despite his full cooperation with the investigation and admission of his role in the events leading to the tragedy, the public viewed him as complicit. By February 2014, Luke resigned from his position and vanished from public life, retreating to an unknown location to escape the intense scrutiny. Emily survived her physical injuries but struggled to recover emotionally. By March 2014, she had moved back in with her parents and filed for divorce. The betrayal and trauma were too great to overcome, leaving her once bright outlook on life replaced with the heavy burden of grief and heartbreak. Sophie's story became a cautionary tale. The media portrayed her as a deeply troubled young woman, a victim of her circumstances but also a perpetrator of unspeakable violence. Public debate erupted over issues of mental health, accountability, and the ethics of relationships between educators and students. For those who knew her, Sophie became a symbol of how unchecked obsession and despair could spiral into tragedy. The Henderson home, once filled with hope and promise, stood empty for months. Eventually, life in the neighborhood returned to its routine, but the memory of that night lingered. It served as a chilling reminder of how lives could unravel under the weight of love, betrayal, and obsession. Sophie's story became a cautionary tale. The media portrayed her as a deeply troubled young woman, a victim of her circumstances, but also a perpetrator of unthinkable violence. Debates surrounding mental health, accountability, and the ethics of relationships between educators and students sparked nationwide discussions. For those who knew her, Sophie represented the devastating consequences of unchecked obsession and despair. The Henderson home, once filled with hope and promise, remained vacant for months. Life in the Cedar Creek neighborhood eventually returned to its routine, but the shadow of that fateful night lingered, a haunting reminder of how quickly lives could unravel under the weight of love, betrayal, and heartbreak. The tragic events in Cedar Creek left an indelible mark on everyone involved. It was a story of love, trust shattered, and the perilous outcomes of concealed truths. A young life was lost, a family was destroyed, and a once peaceful town was forever scarred by the secrets and lies that surfaced. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and stay tuned for another shocking case where a family secret unravels in the most unexpected way.